I grew up in Waterloo, Iowa, which is a town in the northeast corner of Iowa, where most known as the location of the John Deere Tractor Company. As I went through high school, it seems like I did well in the courses that, chemistry and physics and math, and it just seemed like engineering was the place where I could develop a career. So I ended up, going to Iowa State. Happened to major in chemical engineering. I finished with a BS degree in chemical engineering, and then went to Northwestern University and got a PhD in chemical engineering. And at that point, I happened to work on a project involved in heat transfer and porous media, which was sponsored by the API, and some of the recruiters from the oil companies were recruiting at that point, but I had no prior contact with the petroleum production industry. When I completed my PhD, of course, I interviewed another number of companies ranging from chemical companies, oil companies, and then production research, and it turned out that one of the opportunities that I had was related to heat transfer and porous media. So I joined the thermal recovery group in the production research division of Continental Oil Company in Ponca City. So I worked there for 7 years, and I was involved in a variety of different projects involving heat transfer and use of heat transfer to improve oil recovery. So the projects range from in situ combustion, and all of them were related to field projects. The group that I joined was basically a technology application group, and so I had the rare opportunity to be exposed to field projects in several different areas. I worked at Conoco from 1962 to 1969, and so like many situations, there's a point in your career I'd always had an interest in teaching, and it was just about the right time to think about that. There was a position that developed at the University of Kansas, and I interviewed for the position in summer of 1969, and then left Conoco in August of 1969, joined the faculty at the University of Kansas. When I started working on wellbore heat transfer, of course, Conoco had some hot water floods, and I used a model that Hank Ramey developed. I mean, he wrote a very classic paper, and so I was able to apply that model, and then I began to think about, well, how do you reduce the heat loss from wells? And when you start thinking about that, then you think about, well, insulation and a variety of other techniques, and so that led me to the question of, well, Hank really didn't provide much description he didn't provide any description relative to casing temperatures. So I applied, I think, some well-known technology and came up with a way to predict the temperature of casing. And I think this was also driven by the fact that when Conoco got into steam injection, it was pretty obvious that the casing temperature was going to increase. And in most of the steam stimulation projects, they just set tubing on a packer and they didn't do anything about protecting the casing. And in the projects in the Central Valley in Bakersfield, when they were doing steam stimulation, the temperatures were low enough so that nothing happened. I mean, they were able to inject steam by setting tubing on a packer and boiling the annulus out, but and they didn't really pay attention to what the temperature of the casing was because they didn't have any failures. And so I got interested in how to reduce the heat loss from during steam injection, and that led to the development of a way to predict casing temperature. And of course others could have done it. I just happened to be the first one that became concerned about casing temperatures, and this concern was even elevated when Conoco had their first casing failure, and I started looking at that. So I asked the question, well, why did the casing fail? I mean, there wasn't anything particular about that other than that it failed at a joint. And so I looked at the temperatures that I thought that I was able to predict, and talked to some of the metallurgical folks at Conoco, and I think within maybe a week of thinking about that, came up with the reason that the casing failed. And it's very simple. Casing expands thermally, and if you heat it too much, the internal stress can exceed the yield stress of the casing, and it actually deforms. And so when the well cools off, it pulls out, and it happened that the particular joints were API round thread, and it broke the joint and when they cooled the well off. So I mean it's a very simple application of technology, some things I learned when I was a sophomore in college that I thought I'd never use. But anyway, it turned out, and then there was a couple of folks at Conoco. I think Bob McClasson was a metallurgist and helped in developing the notion of pre-stressing tubing. So how do you avoid casing failure? You avoid it by when the casing's going to heat anyway, you just pre-stress it so that as the temperature increases, the stress is relieved, and you can inject at very high temperatures, even with tubing set on a packer, and not cause a failure of the well. And in addition, the other factor was using higher strength casing. So in those wells, I used S95, which 95,000 psi yield, and then buttress thread couplings, which are stronger than they fail at higher stresses than the pipe would fail. So a combination of those two things with the temperature model allowed the design of steam injection wells for the high temperature service. Of course, companies that can inject steam at much lower temperatures do not have to do that, although I notice in Canada that they're all using high stress casing in the steam projects there, and buttress thread couplings. So I think that some of the things that were discovered many years ago have been in some way adopted in the industry, although I had nothing to do with that. When I joined the University of Kansas, there was no research support for enhanced oil recovery at the university. No one was doing anything. And there was no support that I was aware of from outside funds. The way that we got into enhanced oil recovery is sort of serendipitous. It starts out partly because of that. It's related to the oil embargo, also related to the fact that the new chancellor, the chancellor named Archie Dykes, came in July of 1973. This period lasted a long time. And he came in and he put out a general flyer announcement of the university. Do you have any ideas on what we could do to show the value of the university to the state of Kansas? And so at that time, a colleague and I, Don Green and I, and Floyd Preston, got together and we were considering the response to that memo, and we were aware of a number of things. First, there was no enhanced oil recovery research in Kansas. Kansas was a declining state in terms of production. Virtually all of the operators in Kansas were independent operators. They had no research and development capacity. And so what we did was we came up with a proposal, which was known as what became the Tertiary Recovery Project. And what we proposed to do is to see if we could get some support. When we proposed that we would have a research program that would evaluate the potential of oil reservoirs for enhanced oil recovery, do research on processes that would be applicable in Kansas, develop technology transfer programs, develop field demonstration projects, and educate students. And so that proposal was prepared, and in about November of 1973, this covers a span of several years in the process. We used the contacts of Floyd Preston, had been a faculty member for years and knew most of the Kansas, and at least the leaders in the Kansas independent oil industry. And so we arranged to take this proposal to the Eastern Kansas Independent Oil and Gas Association, and we had a meeting with them and talked about that project. We took the proposal to the Kansas Independent Oil and Gas Association, and in both cases we got favorable response. And then as things progressed internationally, the Kansas Independent Oil and Gas Association made a decision to submit the proposal to the governor's office. And that was done I think in December of '73. And in January of '74, the Governor Robert Docking announced that he was going to insert a research program called the Tertiary Recovery Project into the state budget. And that marked the beginning of the funding for enhanced oil recovery and the beginning of what's known as TORP. Now, if we look at the processes that have been developed, some of the processes that I think have significant potential, and much of the work has been done at several different places. So I'm not going to claim that we had major contributions to any of these, but we did some work on polymer flooding. We spent a lot of time looking at surfactant flooding. And surfactant flooding, of course, originally the original concept of micellar polymer flooding started with Marathon, then was picked up evaluated by Exxon, now ExxonMobil, and then I think at that point, after some initial years, we realized that in order to flood fields in Kansas that had high dissolved salt content, high divalent ion content, the surfactants would have to be formulated. That's what Exxon demonstrated. They'd have to be specially made. And so that we essentially shut down that research because we didn't have the staff or anyone in the chemistry department interested that would be able to formulate the chemical stuff. Well, when we were not able to, or when we made a decision that we really could not bring major developments in the surfactant area because of the fact that we couldn't really create the surfactants. We turned our attention to areas that we thought we could apply in Kansas, and the one area that we spent a lot of time on was profile modification. Water production is a major problem in all kinds of fields. And in fact, even the reservoirs and the worldwide reservoirs that nobody was interested in water production 30 years ago are producing water to no one's great surprise. And so water control, at least how to slow down water, is a major factor. So we began a research project stimulated by some of the work, early work at Phillips Petroleum Company, using gel polymers to reduce water. So, and there are two areas that we worked on. One was just injecting gel systems in injection wells that would reduce the permeability in high permeability areas. And the idea behind that was that if you could plug up the high permeability areas, the water would go someplace else and go displace the well, because the high perm areas generally were already, oil displacement was pretty thorough. And so we did work on and field demonstration projects on treating injection wells. Then we also developed some research programs trying to understand how gels placed in production wells could slow down the production of water. And so some of these are fundamental studies. I think we've contributed to the mechanisms of that. In the permeability modification, one of the things that we always did and tried to do is to do some field demonstration projects. And so what we did relative to permeability modification projects is we worked with some of the companies and to determine what actually was going on. When we started out, the companies were just mixing things at the surface and injecting the gelling solution down hole, and they assumed that because gelation was relatively fast, that they were pumping gels into the formations. It turned out that we actually, we proposed for the first time that they put a pressure bomb and that would record pressure, bottom hole pressure, and temperature during placement, and demonstrated that in fact they were just, because fluids were cold at the surface and they didn't warm up when they got down to the bottom, they were actually injecting the gelling solution, and the gelation occurred after the polymer entered the formation. So we did a number of fundamental studies just to understand gel placement. Well, when we did research on polymer flooding, there was a lot of magic involved in polymer flooding. And we set out to determine if you could propagate polymers through porous rocks. And specifically, we looked at the retention of polymers. And there was a question whether polymers were retained by adsorption, or whether they were retained because they were big molecules and they got stuck in the pore space. And what we demonstrated was that polymers were retained because they got stuck in the pore space, so we call mechanical retention. And we conducted a series of experiments that basically showed that happened. Of course, we also showed that many of the polymer molecules got through. So if you accounted for retention, which was not a killer, I mean, some of the early experiments indicated that lots of polymer was retained, but we demonstrated that you could propagate polymers. I entered the oil industry in 1962. So my perspective is broader than some of the folks who entered in later years. When I started out, reservoir simulation was something that at Conoco we had meetings on, and it was the folks who were doing reservoir simulation trying to convince management that what they predicted actually could happen. And of course, the reservoir models at that time were very simplistic. The computers involved were very slow. And so just being a reservoir engineer by background, I can say that there have been tremendous advances in reservoir simulation in terms of, well, aided by, of course, faster computers, aided by visualization packages that allow you to do things. And in the olden days, you used to be able to, you stick in your deck of cards and in the afternoon, and maybe you get it back in the morning with reams of output that took you forever to go through. And of course, the computations that you would do, that I did back then, could be done on the desktop or laptop now. So there have been tremendous advances in visualization. There have also been some advances in reservoir characterization, and part of the advances have been the realization that people don't know how to describe reservoirs very well, and that the numbers they put in the models are just numbers. They're guided by some of the best geological interpretation, but it's still, there are approximations but companies still use reservoir simulations in order to predict future performance, which is probably about the only thing that they can do is reasonable to do. So I look at that area of the general reservoir modeling, both in terms of reservoir simulation, geological modeling. I think there's been better integration of engineers and geologists. You can't live in your separate worlds if you're going to do an integrated problem. So that is one, I think that's one major area of advancement. I think in terms of enhanced oil recovery, I think the surfactant area has advanced. I think it's quite different than what during the first projects in the say the early 70s, when surfactant micellar flooding was looked at. I think technologies that have had perhaps the most impact. One of them is seismic and seismic visualization, where geophones have been implanted in fields, and they're able to follow displacement fronts by doing seismic shots. Seismology is a very important technology that has evolved tremendously since the early 60s when I first heard of it. Not that I didn't understand it then. The other technology which is so prominent now is the ability to drill horizontal wells. It seems really fantastic to me to think that you can drill a horizontal well, you can drill it down, and then you can drill it out. And I think the longest one is something in the vicinity of 7 miles out or more. And I think that is just a revolutionary technology. I mean, it really is a game-changing technology. And a few years ago, I would not have imagined the effect of horizontal wells combined with fracking. But I think the development of horizontal wells and the fracking technology is just truly revolutionary. And it has enabled the oil decline curve to be reversed. oil imports to be backed off, had tremendous economic impact on the country. And so here is one area of technology that's probably done more to affect the balance of payments in the general economy in the United States than anything else in the last 5 years. And so you just sort of stand back and say, I think that's just an amazing technology. Development of technology is for the future is very difficult to project. I think if you look at what people are trying to do now, one of the things that is underway is the question of whether carbon dioxide can be stored in subsurface formations in order to reduce the potential for global warming. I think eventually there'll be some major surfactant chemical floods. The question for all existing reservoirs is when do you shut them in? And there's a substantial resource there, and at some point, whoever has control of the reservoirs has to basically say, well, there's nothing more we can do economically, and at that point, I imagine the wells will be abandoned. Once they're abandoned, it's unlikely that they'll go back into the field again. So there are lots of reservoirs around the world that, if you look at the future, that decision is still sitting there. And so, and that impacts the oil industry. It's very difficult to say how much more oil has yet to be found, oil and gas. There have been many people who have said the oil era is over. My view of that is it's not the oil, the era is over, it's just the era of cheap oil and gas is over. But the industry has a remarkable record of continuing to find oil and gas resources that can be produced. And there are things, people are still, DOE, for example, is looking at production of hydrates from the deep sea. I mean, it's known that gas hydrates are found in the bottom of the ocean, and samples have been pulled up so you can pull them up. So there's a resource there. Whether it can be produced economically or how you produce it, has not really been developed. So, looking at the future, I think there will be developments in that area. What has made my feeling of satisfaction about being in the petroleum industry is that I've been able to work on a number of projects and had developed a sense of accomplishments. I've worked on some field projects that actually came through as expected or nearly as expected. I've been able to teach a lot of students, a lot of petroleum engineering graduates. And I've written a couple of textbooks and published a lot of papers that I think have been contributions to the industry. And so I enjoy what I'm doing. And I wouldn't say that I would pay to do it, but I have not regretted the experiences that I've had.